Today is a somber day for American sovereignty and independence. If the Founding Fathers were still here, they'd be in the town square discussing ways to restore what America lost. They'd be creating, printing, and distributing literature to educate and motivate the people to take action and regain what was lost. They would also organize the people to create pressure on elected officials to take action. What could be so important? Watch today's analysis behind the news to find out, as we bring you perspective and solutions you won't get anywhere else. If you're concerned about American independence and freedom, then please watch and take the recommended actions. Also, be sure to like, subscribe, and share so we can break through big tech censorship and reach many others. So today is United Nations Day, commemorating 79 years of what our founders would have called an entangling alliance. It's the day that the UN was founded in 1945. Official U.S. participation followed on December 4th, 1945. The New American wrote about this in 2013. They wrote, "December 4th is a date on which the U.S. Senate, often called the world's greatest deliberative body, voted to seriously compromise a significant feature of the nation's sovereignty. The bill was approved by the House and signed into law by President Truman later that month. Although both houses of Congress were under a Democratic majority, with a Democratic president, only 6 Republican senators and 1 Democratic senator voted against the bill. Only 2 Republican senators voted against ratification of the UN Charter when that passed the Senate by a vote of 89-2 the previous July. So due to their failure to protect American sovereignty, the U.S. has been embroiled into an aggressive foreign policy of dictating globalism over sovereignty. Supporters call this the post-World War II international rules-based order. This order prioritizes international law over a nation's laws and the rights of its people. The members of the European Union are feeling the full effects of globalization, with their right to independently govern largely taken away. It's not hard to see the effects of this from the waves of migrants that the EU has mandated to be let in, with the full support of the United Nations, of course. As political and economic unions continue to be built around the world, the U.S. continues to be pressured to adapt more international law, to harmonize its industry regulations and specifications with its regional trading partners, and to let our country be awash in migrants that are ignorant of American principles. All of this leads to the goal of making America no different than any other country, and in doing so, can easily be led into a regional economic and political union with Canada and Mexico called the North American Union. Once that occurs, additional integration will be done with other unions until the chains of government tyranny are woven throughout the tapestry of all humanity under a one world government under the United Nations. The Founding Fathers knew of the corrupt nature of understrained government and jealously guarded American sovereignty. In 1796, President George Washington suggested, "It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world." President Thomas Jefferson said, "Commerce with all nations, alliance with none should be our motto," as well as, "I deem one of the essential principles of our government to be peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none." Foreign policy back then was based on protecting the sovereignty and independence of the fledgling country. While commerce was important, the long-term experiment of freedom was more important, as the price of independence was very steep. As Arthur Thompson wrote in his book, International Merger by Foreign Entanglements, there always is a desire for commerce, but there is great danger in forming alliances that really have very little to do with trade and have a lot to do with the accumulation of power, particularly international power through regional institutions such as the European Union and worldwide institutions such as the United Nations. As Lord Acton said, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The founders installed checks and balances on the limited federal government to ensure governing powers stayed in balance, that elected representatives of the people continued to be elected and not appointed, and that governing powers would not be transferred to a body outside of the constitutional republic. Yet, along comes the United Nations with its anti-American charter and human rights declarations that place government in ultimate charge of rights. But that's not what the Founding Fathers created. The Declaration of Independence acknowledges that rights come from God and that governments are instituted to protect those rights. Now, this is quite the opposite of how the UN would govern. Leaders of the UN refer to its Agenda 2030 as the boldest agenda for humanity and a blueprint for a better future to transform the world that leaves no one behind. When the 17 Sustainable Development Goals were launched by the UN in 2015, here's how UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon described the hurdle of sovereignty. He said, "The 2030 Agenda compels us to look beyond national boundaries and short-term interest and act in solidarity for the long term. We can no longer afford to think and work in silos." So to get around this hurdle, the UN has set up a doomsday scenario to take control of every human decision in the name of stopping so-called man-made climate change. Antonio Guterres, the current head of the UN, claims that humanity is responsible for the world entering a climate hell. Yet many scientists don't agree with him, pointing to natural warming and cooling periods largely driven by the sun. So if you're confused about the scientific facts presented by both sides, well, don't feel alone. But instead of looking at the arguments, look at the proposed solutions and remember that would-be tyrants will take full advantage of a crisis to advance their agenda, namely installing more layers of government and seizing control and powers from we the people. Those that claim we need to cut emissions have quite the plan in store for everyone. Cutting emissions means living a sustainable life as defined by these climate alarmists. What it means is no air conditioning. It means way less meat intake. It means getting most of our protein by eating bugs. It means not being able to buy certain appliances like gas cooking stoves or even wood-burning furnaces. It means getting rid of all gasoline and diesel-powered vehicles and small garden and lawn equipment. It means moving the population into urban centers called 15-minute cities. It means unstable electrical grids based on switching to highly unreliable solar and wind sources. It means placing a greater priority on animals and nature than on humans. It means much more governmental control, which is the only way to implement these radical environmental initiatives. In the U.S., government has a delicate balance between the three federal branches of government and between the states and the federal government. Any legislating outside of the assigned constitutional powers is unconstitutional. Yet to properly administer the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the UN's Agenda 2030, many more layers of government will be required and implemented. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the European Union, with its EU government taking over much of the legislative functions of member nations. The late U.S. Senator George Malone exposed in his 1958 book Mainline another tool of building up world government: free trade agreements. He wrote, "Free trade is the economic weapon of globalists who seek to erase national borders and consolidate power in international institutions. It is a tool to weaken the United States and to pave the way for a global government." So I asked ChatGPT to chart free trade agreements, unions, and alliances on a world map to see the large number of entangling alliances. Here is what it created. Now, this mess denotes the interconnectedness and interdependence that countries have upon each other. This is globalism at the expense of independence. This is what the Founding Fathers warned us against. Senator Malone also wrote, "By opening our markets to foreign goods, we are sacrificing the very industries that form the backbone of our economic and military strength. This is not free trade. It is the systematic dismantling of American industry." Given what has happened to not just American manufacturing, but manufacturing around the globe, Senator Malone has been proven accurate. Industry is systematically being dismantled around the globe, and many countries are turning into service economies, with a large reliance on other countries for staple items, like China. While Americans have largely been distracted by presidential politics, globalists continue to build up entangling alliances through heavily government-managed trade. Last week, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations concluded its summit, with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken announcing new trade and defense agreements within the association. A new trade agreement was also announced by the association between itself and China that is designed to further economically integrate China with the association's members. Mr. Blinken and the larger Biden-Harris administration have not done much with trade during their term, but they certainly supported globalism and its related principles by reversing many of the Trump policies that were America first instead of globalist first. Historically, those supporting international socialism have viewed trade as a means to deliver revolution. In his testimony to the U.S. Senate on February 21, 1958, Senator Malone said, "Mr. President, the International Socialism Plan calls for A, reduction of all barriers to the flow of international trade, B, access to raw materials of all sorts for all nations, C, access to markets for all nations, D, a world organization through which the nations can share freely in the supplies and the markets of the world." Senator Malone concluded, "Mr. President, there can be only one result and only one final solution if these objectives are allowed to obtain, and that is, of course, the leveling of the living standards of the United States of America with the sweatshop labor nations of the world." And we are certainly seeing that in America today. These last 4 years of anti-American policies have been the culmination of a great reversal to our founding principles. And let's add that it has certainly been a bipartisan effort too. The United Nations Agenda 2030 is an infection that has been spreading throughout the U.S. since its predecessor, Agenda 21, was introduced in 1992. Indeed, the UN is a cancer that was intentionally placed in the American body by communists and their New World Order supporters to transform its politics and policies so as to be easily integrated into world government. Look around. Increased crime, migrant surges, censorship, unsustainable spending and debt, rampant inflation, and attacks on lifestyle, industry, and God-given rights are all a deliberate attempt to do as Senator Malone and as founder of the John Birch Society, Robert Welch, warned about: to install world tyranny under world government. The John Birch Society's longest action project is Get Us Out of the United Nations. Since 1962, the organization has distributed millions of educational pieces of literature and videos throughout the country regarding the threat the UN poses to America. Well, here is another chart created by ChatGPT of U.S. public approval of the UN from 1945 to 2024. Notice the huge decline. Even some of the globalists are upset at the current standing of the United Nations. The Council on Foreign Relations, a leading globalist think tank, recently published an essay in its November/December 2024 issue of Foreign Affairs titled, "Can the United Nations Be Saved?" Regarding the never-ending question of whether or not the UN was created to be world government, the author's sentence of "the seeds of a future planetary government were evident from the start" should plainly answer it in the affirmative. And as a testament to all the efforts of the John Birch Society's project, the author wrote, "The global body, the UN, is more needed than ever before, yet less relevant as a political actor than at any time since its establishment in 1945. He also wrote, "It is easy to see why enthusiasm for the UN in much of the world has steadily declined." The John Birch Society suggests UN Day is a perfect day to pledge to relegate this anti-American and anti-freedom institution to the dustbin of history. Let's use the momentum we have to get us out of the United Nations. To do so takes some work on our part. There are currently 2 bills in the U.S. House and Senate called the Defund Act, which will revoke the U.S. membership in the UN and defund the UN. Do 3 things today to help move this along. 1. Use our federal legislative alert to contact Congress and tell them to vote on both of these bills. Now, of course, we know it probably won't get a vote, and we certainly know that President Biden wouldn't sign it if it were to make it to his desk. But you know what? It doesn't matter. Do it anyway, because this will help to elevate the issue in the eyes of your federal representatives and their staff. 2, be prepared to hit this issue hard in 2025, especially if President Trump wins the election. Familiarize yourself with our newest items in this project so you know the issues. These educational tools are located at the Get Us Out Action Project at jbs.org or at shopjbs.org. Our latest magazine issue covers this very well. Also, take advantage of holiday sales offers to stock up on our UN literature, books, and videos. And 3, chapters of the John Birch Society will soon be directed by their coordinators to begin assembling Get Us Out ad hoc committees to help draw in non-member support for this issue on a local level. Also, brainstorm ideas of how to make additional community connections that advance this project. We need to hit the ground running to make the most of our time. It can and must be done. To work with other patriots in your area on this and other related projects, join the John Birch Society today. I'm Bill Hahn for the John Birch Society, and until next time, educate yourself, educate others, and organize.